So I wonder if we could start with cities and regions, and maybe one of you could talk about what happened, and we could have contributions, questions, either from other members of the group or from those of you who were in other groups.
Okay, well, actually, we had an interesting discussion, and the first point that came up was that we should not call it city/region, but we should call it place. You know, how the notion of place itself is deployed in symbolic production, and how the notion of place gets complicated when a certain vein of cultural production takes off. And it was also pointed out that we should do more empirical studies on different cities, you know, that have had different experiences with creative industries. In some cities, creative industries have failed. In some cities, it has been a success. And in some cities, there has been no discourse on creative industries. So, you know, there's a range of cities that we need to take account of. And we also thought that, you know, this kind of an empirical approach also would take into account the distinct histories of different cities, and, you know, how conflicts emerge, because, you know, they've had a different historical trajectory. And the other question that came up was, again, the question of scale, you know. Who is the agent, and how do we imagine the place? What is the scale? And are we talking about the region? Are we talking about the nation itself? Are we talking about the city? Are we talking about a neighborhood? So at what level is this reimagination deployed? And what kind of conflicts emerge because of, you know, these different levels of, you know, cultural imagination that gets deployed both by the state-driven policy and also by, you know, bottom-up kind of, you know, approach where the creative producers are not necessarily organized, but they have their own way of appropriating the development. Yeah, so these are some of the themes that we thought should be pursued, yeah.
Anybody from outside that group who'd like to ask a question or pose something about place, space, city, region? It's an interesting issue to raise, I think, about the extent to which these things should be understood in terms of political entities, formal geographical lines, versus the extent to which they should be thought of, say, as relating to actual economic practice, and whether that actual economic practice should be the grey economy, the black economy, the conventional economy, and so forth that you've raised.
I'm not sure if your group touched on it or not, and it's something that I'm certainly not an expert on at all, but I'm wondering to what extent the sort of the initiative of creative industries start at a local level to sort of enhance, promote, build, develop economies at the local level, and end up requiring services from other localities such that, you know, they organically become, in this kind of information age that we live in, you know, place has less and less to do with it, even though the initial intent is to at the very local level. Mm-hmm. Outsourcing, what have you.
I was thinking about the same thing, that in many of the places that I visit that deal with creative industries, there's two major networks of actors: British cultural policy wonks, and Spanish, especially Catalonian ones, that are very active in when a particular city or cultural commission seeks to see what they can do, they will bring on the expertise. And from the perspective of Latin Americanists, it's seen that creative industries consultation has become in itself an industry that, at least for the Spanish, has found a huge market in Latin America.
Okay, well, shall we move on to our second group, which was the application, relevance, teaching question? What the payoff is of this?
We, I don't know how directly we approached the name of the group. I mean, we had more of a general conversation about just the scope of the 2-week seminar. But one of the, I'll just kind of emphasize some of the issues that emerged, and I should say that just based on the people that we had in the group, the kinds of research people are doing within our group is pretty eclectic. Somebody's doing stuff on, and I'm sorry, I'm still learning names, on punk zines and kind of DIY culture. Another person is doing work on heritage studies. Someone else mentioned gaming studies. I'm really glad to see the variety of people who are participating in the seminar. But one of the big questions we were trying to think about is what is the critical project here, and what is the relationship between, the creative industries model that grows out of neoliberalism and the cultural studies model that grows out of critical theory and a kind of Marxist critique, and how do we, as I think Andrew and Toby both have discussed and published about also, what is the relationship between cultural studies and creative societies, and how do we rhetorically position ourselves to sustain some of the momentum and interdisciplinarity that comes out of cultural studies, and inscribe that within the critical models that we develop to study and research and participate in creative industries. And one thing that we were thinking is that we need to constantly, the question that kept coming up among people is what kind of knowledge are we producing, and then who are our readers, and what is our relationship within the university to whatever we want to imagine as outside of the university. And we also had some critical reflection about whether we should imagine something as outside of the university or not. And Andrew made the important point that we should not think of this space as kind of quarantined, and that we need to think really critically and openly about creative societies as a model that's now being institutionalized. And the example of the University of Queensland was brought up, where the humanities has been renamed. I think, is it renamed by John Hartley?
It's Queensland University of Technology, actually.
Okay, sorry. It's just been, he's going to participate in the seminar, so I'm
He
sure
is,
this will
yeah,
come up.
Yeah.
But to be constantly thinking about the relationship between the university and the public sphere, I mean, I think the humanities has been doing this for a long time. And so not only who are our readers, what is our relationship to the creative industries, but also what kind of form should our work take as researchers and as scholars, and that this moment of the shift toward creative industries might provide an opportunity for us to be much more flexible about our own labor and move beyond a kind of logocentrism that tends to permeate the humanities, and think more about being directly involved in policy making, policy writing, different kinds of writing, and also art practice. So policy making and artistic practice might be thought about as part of the rubric of academic labor within the humanities if we move more into a kind of flexible model of creative industries. And we were also acutely aware that that also may place more burdens on us in terms of our own labor, but it also could make life more exciting, interesting, and our work more relevant and significant in the context of these changes that are happening in different local and national and global contexts. Let's see, what else? I think I'm probably not mentioning some of the important things that came up, but we ended by dealing with pedagogy issues, and Andrew mentioned the fact that many of our students are already leagues ahead of us in terms of their preparedness for the multiplicity of their skills, and kind of preparing for the transitions that are happening in the kind of creative industry sector, if you want to call it that. Does anybody from the group want to add something that I may not have mentioned? I don't want to take too much time. No?
So any questions or thoughts from those outside that? Yeah.
I'm not from the group, but I have a question. I'm particularly interested on the question of who is our reader, especially as some of us, most of us who work at research institutions, and we have to publish in peer-reviewed journals, or we work with countries that English is not the spoken language and the written language there. How do we get back to then our studies on them? I mean, how much are we supposed to report to them? How much are they supposed to know what we are doing? You know, how we are studying them? And on the other side, also the fact that lately it's been some sort of like this sort of celebration of multiculturalism, like anybody from the third world can speak. I mean, and we tend to bring here to the United States or to Europe people in the third world that perhaps are not very good writers or very good filmmakers and stuff like that. You know, where's the to which extent, you know, are we going to be doing this? I mean, what are the limits for that? I don't know if it's a question, but I mean, those are things that I keep, you know, asking myself.
Does anybody from the group want to respond to that, or?
I'm not sure if that's the best answer, but I studied in London, but I'm originally from Turkey. And when you look at Turkey, I mean, depending on the university system that the country has adapted, you know, it's not like, you know, all the departments all around the world, they take the studies of sociology or cultural studies that's here, and then they go back and study that, or, you know, reproduce it in their own departments. That's always one way in which, you know, they first, all these questions about cultural production or subjectivity, they, you know, although it's usually studied in English or the sort of original language in which it was produced, it goes back and, you know, these cultures ask themselves the same questions. All those students and professors, you know, it's the same, go through the same process of, I guess, you know, explaining what it is and identity, you know, trying to understand their own identity. And secondly, I would say, although we're usually very critical of like globalized artistic processes like such as biennales or art fairs, I would say in Turkey we just had the 10th Biennale last year, and it's been amazing because all these issues that we talk about here are sort of, you know, you have local artists going to these biennales, and you have all these workshops and talks with professors or, you know, just curators, people from London or US or what have you, and, you know, talking about urban planning, cultural production, what does that mean, although we can be always critical about, you know, globalization in that sense, these things always have their own way of going back, and I guess there are these alternative let-outs for, you know, how people take these ideas and think about what they do, what they can do with it themselves. So I think I'm not too negative, but, you know.
That's a good segue into I think the globalization, post-colonialism group maybe, but I think before we do that, we did have one or two other questions, issues, if they can be quick.
I just wanted to respond very directly to the model of you publish and who are your readers, which in some sense is superannuated. I mean, most of what we publish, we don't have any readers for what we publish. So, but within the rubric of this topic, there is an opportunity really to speak to policymakers if you're not afraid to do that, if you think there's some contagion that you might catch. And starting at a local level, you know, whatever campus or academic town or city, where the institution itself is a major driver of economic development in this field, in precisely this field, knowledge/creative communication, education sectors. And in order to do so, you know, we have to learn how to compete with the emerging body of consultants who are already doing that, who are already commanding the ears of policymakers, and who are, you know, learn to speak in a much more serviceable manner than we would. But it seems to me that and that's an activist project, how you speak to policymakers, not just elected officials, but also our own policymakers on campus, whose decision-making has a very real impact on regional development increasingly.
Globalization, post-colonial.
Well, our group had a big topic. We started talking about different scales that are pretty obvious: the global, the national, the local, and the different relevance that are attached to those scales. We gave a number of examples of the following process: culture that presupposes producers, processes of circulation, consumers, funders, labor. And one thing that came across in the different examples is how at the national level, globalization means the non-coincidence of these processes of production, circulation, reception, And a number of examples were given around that. In the case of South Korea, in the case of Chile, in the case of Catalonia in Spain, whether the money was coming from elsewhere or the producer was actually an immigrant, or the specific Catalonian location in connection with the national state, there was a non-coincidence of these cultural processes with the scholar level at which they were being thought. This led us to think of the different roles the state can play in different contexts, the U.S. versus the rest, for example, or a third world country versus the U.S. This also led us to an interesting question about how is it that the U.S., being a great producer of culture that can export, is itself not so good or has not been so good at remixing the cultures that are coming to it. So how the outflow is beautifully performed while the inflow is not so smooth. We talked about the blurring of some fundamental distinctions such as commercial and non-commercial. This was connected to the predominance of the discourse of neoliberalism, which in the many examples that we refer to connected private industries, non-governmental groups, local producers, state funding in different ways. George mentioned the word heritage, and whether you call it heritage or culture or a national identity or local or regional identity, the issue is heritage, identity, culture, for whom, for the benefit of whom, for the exercise, to be produced by whom, circulating where. I think that's what we did.
Okay, great. Any questions, subtractions, additions people might want to make?
We all had limited time, so we weren't able to get some other aspects of globalization, post-colonialism, so on and so forth. And that's what I mentioned before, this intergovernmental structures like the WTO, the trade agreement, so on and so forth, that put another layer beyond questions of scale, whether we're talking about nations, local governments. There's another scale that cross-cuts and has to do with these juridical arrangements that can actually be exercised and wielded over all different kinds of scales.
Okay, rolling right along to the immovable object of the state.
Before you do that,
Yeah.
can I just raise a question of the historical, which is put on the table by the notion of heritage, and the question of historical in relation to temporality and what it does, what this industrializing of the conception of history does as a kind of flattening mechanism. And I think, for example, of plantation slavery museums that have flourished in the South, not only the Deep South, but and also places like Jamaica and so on. The contemporizing of the historical in a way which undercuts the historicity of the historical itself, if I can put it in those terms. So it's just to place on the table the question of how one understands the historical and what industrializing, if that's the right term, does to the question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it makes you think about how public history is both the instantiation of history from below and also a commodity term, commodity move, right? So, the state.
I've never spoken for the state before. Okay. So I don't think I have. I probably I don't know. Okay.
We're prepping you.
Okay. So none of us actually come from a background in policy, so we tried to approach this however we could, and this is kind of where we ended up. Broadly, we talked about how questions or conceptions of the state are being revised or evaluated in light of the specter and practices of the creative industries, the cultural industries, intellectual property, and creative work, in general terms. for instance, we were curious, how do conversations about the creative class or creative industries make it possible for popular conversations about the power and legitimacy of the state? Like, how does it make it possible, not just in the academy, but outside of the academy? For instance, how do international copyright disputes and charges of international corruption forge popular and critical conversations about the state and its importance, not just in terms of how the state funds art, although that's one of them, but also the state itself? You know, how is it the state or the corporations that are being served here? What's the role of the state these days? We were also curious, what do cultural industries produce for the state directly and indirectly, not just in terms of, you know, gentrifying communities and bringing, you know, new types of economies and industries, but also what types of identities and whatnot are producing. How and can the cultural industries critically respond directly and indirectly to the state's more repressive actions? How do cultural workers kind of legitimate themselves as being anti-establishment, you know? How do, I don't know, these kind of weird identities that you have, you know, directly relate to the state and your relationship to it? The words that we came up with to talk about this, since we didn't have like policy backgrounds, if I'm, you know, like were obviously pretty repressive words because we're thinking about the state and our version of it. But we're thinking about censorship, corruption, forced migration, and the limited immigration, that work visas and how the state kind of intervenes there, the type of IP policing and litigation that the state seems to, you know, produce or whatever. And those types of terms then generated some more specific conversations that I could try to reproduce, but I don't know how well I would do that. So does that cover everything? Does anyone want to add? I'm trying to roll up. We had lots of little conversations about this, but those are some of the ways we'd form these questions.
That's great. Others got some responses to that or other comments you'd like to make?
Just a quick one, an obvious one, and it's the differential role both through space and time that the state that you are referring to in these processes, may or may not play. In our group, for example, it was mentioned that in the case of South Korea or in the case of Chile, there would be no film industry without state funding. So simply that.
Yeah.
Just a very brief thing that the state is very often thought of in repressive capacities, but a lot of well, in this unreadable paper that I sent because it's in Portuguese, there's a lot of references to the work of people like Lazzarato and Negri and so on and so forth, who are looking at the state that elicits expression from its subjects. And so a lot of the opportunities made available through all kinds of cultural centers is so people can express themselves. And so the question of how this is handled is a two-pronged one. Express yourself in a way that's much more incorporative into the society, and then, of course, the repressive aspects, which are part of the two-pronged strategy.
Okay, I think we've got one more intervention. I thought I'd be the first to say the word on the stage.
Real quick, we're supposed to see the withering away of the state, and instead what we're seeing is a different disposition of territory, authority, and rights, right? That's Saskia Sassen's way of looking at it. And what you see about, what I mean about that in particular is that the state only gives certain protections to certain of its populations. And for example, if you go to the mega cities of what is called the Global South, you'll see huge populations that don't have access to the basic rights offered by the state. But also, secondly, the state is also becoming branded, and that branding is becoming an implement of foreign policy. And you know, you can see that across every nation on earth right now. So it's interesting. For something that was supposed to be going away, it seems to have a particularly interesting afterlife.
Yeah, every time it withers, it means somebody else wants to start a different one. So the subject, Omar,
So yeah, we this is a great, I think, segue, because when I heard the questions that your group had about the state and the state versus the corporation, that was kind of the starting point for the question that I led our group with, which was, if I can find it, basically, what is the subject? If the subject is something that is that the state or that civil society really is formulated to protect, to create, and is in turn also itself creates the subject. So if there's this dialogue between the subject and between subject and culture, between subject and civil society, what are the implications for culture if the apparatus that creates it and that it creates, civil society, maintains and enhances the subjectivity of some, that is, the pegs on which translation and empathy and things like that can hang, and destroys the subjectivity of others through its very actions. For example, paving over urban spaces to make room for a new creative space. Even as it incorporates some members of the urban group that was displaced to legitimize itself. What are the implications for subjectivity if it is itself created by a violence that is intrinsic to civil society? And so that led Lisa to ask, what are the implications for humanity or for subjectivity when there is a hierarchy of subjectivity and non-subjectivity of kind of ultimate insidership and ultimate outsidership. And Lisa said the notion of universal humanism gets thrown into question. Linda brought us back to pointing out that excuse me, the ways in which marginalized peoples get involved in the. I hope I'm, yeah. Marginalized people get involved in in the creative industries. And I guess our group shifted. I felt like the question that we shifted to kind of was creativity. Was what does it create? Zainab led us with this a comment about let's see, a cultural terrorist named Banksy. Is that yeah? Who didn't want to be identified as an artist, who romanticized, who kind of fed the image of the romantic creative, who was somehow outside but ended up being sort of incorporated back inside the system later on, the very system that he was supposed to be questioning. And I guess we moved on from there to talking about hip hop, to talking about forms of art that are originally sort of grungy and dingy, and making this sort of association, and that it eventually becomes something that re-legitimizes the system. This is the creation of subjects who aren't entirely maybe questioning the system in which they live, but yet I don't know. I still had the question at the end, what is the subject, and what who is included in subjectivity and who is not included. I'm leaving out a lot of things. We talked about YouTube. We talked. Kate came in and mentioned the deterritorialization of work that YouTube fosters, and that YouTube is really kind of a distribution of culture. It's not really creating a new culture. Culture is something that starts locally that gets distributed through YouTube, and that it should trouble us that it is so much of it is unpaid. There were a lot of questions that Zainab and Veronica and Marilyn, Lisa, Linda, we all kind of raised, and I guess I ended still having the question, what is the subject? Yeah.
Yes.
That's maybe where we should be.
It's on YouTube. Any quick questions on that? You left out the First World War, it seems. An appalling exception. Apart from that, I think most topics were covered by your group, by the sound of it. And lucky last, the C word, the crisis of the humanities, the C word, the creative industries response.
Well, we definitely did not solve the crisis, but we tried. We talked about a lot of the same subjects that have come up already, and sort of how the humanities fits into that, and how we're struggling. We started with a discussion of the South Korean biennial, and where did that start and where has that taken us, and what does that mean about boundaries and looking beyond this idea of the nation state and toward globalization. We kind of stuck with the idea of boundaries as part of this crisis, that we're trying really hard to fit the humanities into a discipline, but really it has to incorporate all these other disciplines that are out there and then how do you kind of contain it so you can understand it and you can use a language to analyze it and to talk through it. And so, you know, is that the crisis that we're trying to contain the humanities? Well, maybe. Another crisis that we came up with was sort of the direction of the humanities, and if it was, you know, born out of philosophy, as we discussed earlier, you know, where is it going, and do we need a direction for it? And if so, where do we want that direction to be? And then I think the real crisis that we settled on at this point is, in this globalized society, do we have the analytical tools that we need to discuss the humanities and to apply it to, you know, non-Western systems and, you know, alternative cultures and countries? And I think what we came up with was that we really don't have the tools, and that we're trying to apply a Western set of tools to study non-Western practices. And, you know, we're sort of struggling to look at religion, but we're using, you know, secular tools to do that. So it all sort of results in a question of translation and, you know, how can we translate the tools and translate, you know, through this language and through these disciplines to sort of understand what we're trying to get at with the humanities.
Great, thanks. Any contributions, questions on that? Well, thanks everybody. Oh, sorry. Yes. Thanks to you.
We've been talking a lot about difference across national boundaries, across race and ethnicity, across the idea of the global north versus the global south, and I guess I just wanted to ask or offer that we might also want to consider difference in a more localized context, the ways in which, for instance, those of us, you know, as an Americanist, for instance, in my case, that being a person in a particular kind of involved in academia, which, as we've been discussing, as elite, as bourgeois, and then, for instance, studying people that studying people in cultures that are not per se academic. And so this, what does it mean to, I mean, at this very sort of basic level of, even when we're still speaking, you know, like within U.S. culture, you know, how are our analytical tools, rhetorical tools failing because even the difference between perhaps the academic elite and that which is not academic per se is the difference is too great maybe to use those tools. Am I making any sense? So, okay.
Okay, well, I think we will have a break now.